April Ashley didn't just break gender barriers. She was broken by them, becoming the first person in British legal history to be declared non-existent while still breathing, still fighting, still refusing to disappear into the shadows that society demanded she inhabit. When Justice Ormrod's gavel fell in 1970 declaring her marriage void because it is not possible to change sex, he didn't just annul a union. He erased a human being from the legal record, transforming Britain's most photographed model into a legal ghost whose very existence became a threat to the established order. But was April Ashley a courageous pioneer who sacrificed everything for authenticity, or was she an accidental martyr whose personal choices inadvertently destroyed legal protections for an entire generation of transgender people? Did she liberate future generations through her visibility, or did she set back the cause by decades when her public exposure created the legal precedent that would criminalize transgender existence until 2004? The woman who could command magazine covers and aristocratic marriage proposals left behind a legacy that forces us to question whether some revolutions require sacrificial victims, or whether martyrdom is simply what happens to people who refuse to remain invisible when society demands it. The mathematics of her contradiction defy every social convention. Visible enough to grace Vogue, invisible enough to be legally erased, beautiful enough to marry nobility, unreal enough to have that marriage voided, successful enough to inspire millions, powerless enough to spend 40 years as a legal non-person. For 11 years, she was Britain's most celebrated transgender woman. And for the next 40, she was living proof that existence and recognition are two entirely different things in a society that can celebrate you while simultaneously denying your right to exist. This is not the sanitized story of transgender progress that modern activists want you to remember. This is the story of someone who weaponized glamour to challenge fundamental assumptions about gender, identity, and legal recognition, who proved that the most dangerous thing about authentic living is that it forces everyone around you to examine the authenticity of their own existence, often with catastrophic results for the person brave enough to go first. George Jamieson entered the world on April 29, 1935, at Sefton General Hospital in Liverpool. Not as the elegant goddess who would grace magazine covers, but as one of 10 children born to a family where survival was more important than self-expression, where economic necessity made personal identity a luxury that few could afford. Frederick Jamieson was a Roman Catholic sailor whose devotion to drink often outweighed his devotion to family, while Ada Brown was a Protestant mother who had married across religious lines in a city where such choices carried social consequences. Liverpool in the 1930s was a port city caught between industrial prosperity and working-class poverty, where gender roles were as rigid as the social hierarchies that determined everything from employment opportunities to marriage prospects. But the Jamieson household existed on the margins of respectability, in neighborhoods where children learned early that conformity was not just social expectation but survival strategy, and where deviation from prescribed norms could result in ostracism, violence, or worse. The child who would become April Ashley was born frail and feminine, refusing to eat most food and suffering from malnutrition and calcium deficiency that required weekly medical interventions. But more troubling to family and neighbors was George's early behavior, playing with dolls, preferring girls' company, and demonstrating what contemporary medical professionals would have diagnosed as serious psychological disturbance requiring immediate correction through whatever means were available. The beatings that George received from family members were not random violence but systematic attempts to correct behavior that was seen as threatening to the entire family's social standing. Ada Brown was particularly harsh, understanding that having a feminine son would bring shame and suspicion on her entire household, making normal life impossible in communities where reputation was often the only form of wealth that working-class families possessed. But the physical abuse was accompanied by emotional trauma that was arguably more damaging. the constant message that George's most authentic feelings and impulses were not just wrong but dangerous, that survival required the complete suppression of anything that might be interpreted as feminine, and that love and acceptance were conditional on maintaining a performance that became more difficult to sustain with each passing year. The young person who prayed every night to wake up as a girl was not expressing a childhood fantasy but articulating a form of psychological distress that had no name in the 1940s Britain, no medical recognition, and no treatment beyond punishment designed to eliminate the source of the problem through forced conformity and constant surveillance by adults who believed they were saving George from a fate worse than death. The escape that George found by joining the Merchant Navy at age 16 was not the adventure that recruitment posters promised, but a desperate flight from a home environment that had become psychologically unbearable. The military provided structure, clear expectations, and the kind of hyper-masculine environment that family members hoped would cure George of feminine tendencies. But it also provided new forms of isolation and internal conflict that made normal relationships with fellow sailors almost impossible to maintain. The rape that George suffered from a roommate was not just physical assault, but a confirmation that the feminine qualities that felt authentic were seen by others as invitations to violence, that survival required not just hiding feelings, but eliminating them entirely, and that the world was divided into people who took what they wanted and people who were taken from, with no middle ground available for someone who didn't fit either category comfortably. The suicide attempts that followed were not cries for help but logical responses to circumstances that seemed to offer no possibility of authentic existence. George could continue living as someone he wasn't, risking psychological destruction, or he could die as someone he was, achieving a form of authenticity that life seemed unable to provide. The psychiatric treatment that followed the second suicide attempt included electric shock therapy that was primitive even by 1950s standards, designed to eliminate problematic thoughts and feelings without providing any alternative framework for understanding or managing psychological distress. But the hospital experience also provided George with the first encounter with medical professionals who suggested that gender identity might be more complex than simple male-female categories, that surgical intervention might be possible for people whose psychological gender didn't match their physical anatomy, and that there were places in the world where such procedures were being performed by doctors who understood that some forms of psychological suffering could only be addressed through physical transformation. The move to London in 1955 represented more than geographical relocation. It was George's first experience of a city large enough to provide anonymity, diverse enough to include people who didn't fit conventional categories, and cosmopolitan enough to connect with European cultures that were more tolerant of gender variance than anything available in provincial Britain. The jobs that George found, table wiping, bacon slicing, and other forms of manual labor, provided basic survival while allowing experimentation with gender expression that would have been impossible in Liverpool's more conservative environment. The nickname eyelashes that George acquired after Albert Einstein remarked on the thick lashes that should belong to Madame Butterfly represented the first public recognition that George's feminine qualities were not deformities to be corrected, but gifts to be celebrated. This encounter was transformative not because Einstein was famous, but because he represented intellectual authority that valued beauty over conformity, aesthetic appreciation over social convention. The transition from London to Paris was motivated by more than career opportunities. It represented George's first encounter with a culture where gender nonconformity was not just tolerated but celebrated, where cabaret performances allowed the exploration of feminine identity without the pretense that such expressions were merely entertainment rather than authentic self-presentation. Le Carrousel de Paris was famous for its transgender performers who lived as women off stage as well as on, providing George with the first examples of people who had successfully navigated the transition from assigned male identity to authentic female existence. The name Tony April was not just a stage name, but a form of identity experimentation that allowed George to test how it felt to be addressed as female, treated as female, and recognized as female by audiences who had no knowledge of biological history. The cabaret performances were simultaneously employment and therapy, providing income while allowing the gradual development of feminine mannerisms, fashion sense, and social skills that would be necessary for complete transition. But the cabaret years were also an education in the economics of gender transition. April worked and saved £3,000, an enormous sum for a working-class person in the 1950s to pay for surgery that was experimental, dangerous, and available only in foreign countries where medical regulations were less restrictive than anything available in Britain or America. The financial sacrifice represented not just personal commitment, but understanding that authentic living would require ongoing costs that most people never had to consider. The friendships that April formed with other transgender performers, particularly Coccinelle, provided more than emotional support. They provided practical information about medical procedures, legal strategies, and survival techniques that were not available through any official channels. Coccinelle provided the contact information for Dr. George Bureau in Casablanca, but more importantly, she provided proof that complete transition was possible, that feminine identity could be achieved through medical intervention, and that post-surgical life could include professional success, romantic relationships, and social acceptance in at least some circles. The decision to undergo surgery represented the culmination of years of preparation, but it also represented a form of ultimate gamble, with stakes that included not just money and physical health, but the possibility of achieving authentic identity, versus the risk of losing everything in pursuit of something that might prove to be impossible to achieve. Dr. Bureau had warned that there was only a 50% chance of survival, but for April, the alternative, continuing to live as George, represented a form of death that was slower but equally certain. The 7-hour surgery on May 12, 1960 was performed under primitive conditions by a surgeon whose techniques were experimental, but when April awakened to the words, "Bonjour, mademoiselle," she had achieved something that medical experts insisted was impossible. The physical transformation of male anatomy into functional female anatomy that would allow her to live as a woman in every aspect of her life, including sexual relationships and legal recognition. The recovery was excruciating. All her hair fell out, and she endured significant pain. But April later described this period as the happiest of her life, not because the physical experience was pleasant, but because for the first time her body matched her psychological sense of herself, creating a form of internal harmony that she had never experienced and had sometimes doubted was possible to achieve. The return to Britain was planned as a quiet reintegration into British society, with April hoping to establish a new identity without revealing her transgender history to anyone who didn't need to know. She was able to obtain official documents, passport, driver's license, national insurance number, that recognized her as female, suggesting that legal transition was possible for people who could navigate bureaucratic systems without drawing unwanted attention to their cases. The modeling career that followed represented April's attempt to achieve the kind of conventional feminine success that she had always dreamed of. Professional recognition for beauty, fashion sense, and the kind of elegant femininity that magazines and advertisers used to sell products to women who aspired to similar sophistication. The photograph by David Bailey for British Vogue represented not just professional achievement, but cultural validation. April had not just become a woman, but had become the kind of woman that other women envied and men desired. The film role alongside Bob Hope and Bing Crosby in The Road to Hong Kong suggested that April's transition from model to actress was proceeding smoothly. that she was achieving the kind of mainstream success that would allow her to live as a woman without constant anxiety about discovery or exposure. The role was small but significant, proof that April could function convincingly as a woman in professional contexts where biological history was irrelevant to job performance. But the success of April's new life was built on the assumption that her transgender history could remain private indefinitely, that the people who had known George Jamieson would either forget or remain silent, and that the medical and legal records of her transition could be kept confidential. These assumptions proved catastrophically wrong when a friend sold her story to the Sunday People for £5 in November 1961, leading to publication under the headline, "Her Secret is Out." The media exposure that followed was not simple celebrity scandal but a form of public persecution that destroyed April's career overnight and transformed her from successful professional woman into object of curiosity, ridicule, and moral condemnation. Her agency immediately canceled all upcoming work. Her film credit was dropped from The Road to Hong Kong, and she was told that she would never work in entertainment again. But the media coverage also revealed the extent to which April's very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about gender, sexuality, and identity that British society was not prepared to question or accommodate. The newspaper articles focused not on her professional achievements or personal courage, but on the sensational aspects of her transition, treating gender confirmation surgery as a form of elaborate deception rather than medical treatment for a recognized psychological condition. The public reaction to April's outing demonstrated that British tolerance for gender nonconformity was extremely limited and conditional on maintaining invisibility. People could accept transgender individuals as entertainment figures or exotic curiosities, but they could not accept them as ordinary citizens with the same rights and opportunities as anyone else. April's crime was not being transgender, but being successfully transgender, proving that complete transition was possible and thereby threatening the stability of gender categories that most people accepted without question. April's response to the media exposure was to tell her own story in the News of the World in May 1962, attempting to control the narrative by providing accurate information about her transition and challenging some of the misconceptions that had been promoted by initial coverage. But this strategy backfired by generating additional publicity that made it impossible for April to return to normal professional life, even in contexts where her transgender history was irrelevant to job requirements. The period following her outing was characterized by social isolation, financial insecurity, and the constant stress of living under public scrutiny from people who felt entitled to opinions about her most personal medical decisions and life choices. April had achieved authentic gender identity through surgical transition, but she had lost the privacy and social acceptance that made authentic living possible in practical terms. The meeting with Arthur Corbett in November 1960 had initially seemed like a romantic fairy tale. A successful, educated aristocrat who was attracted to April without knowledge of her transgender history, suggesting that she could form intimate relationships based on her current identity rather than her biological past. Corbett was not just wealthy but titled, representing the kind of social acceptance that could validate April's femininity in the most conventional possible terms. The marriage in 1963 took place in Gibraltar, possibly to avoid the kind of publicity that a London wedding might have attracted, but also because Gibraltar's legal jurisdiction might have been seen as providing additional protection for a union that could potentially be challenged in British courts. For April, the marriage represented the ultimate validation of her feminine identity. She had not just become a woman, but had become the kind of woman that aristocratic men wanted to marry. But the marriage was troubled from the beginning by Corbett's psychological issues, including cross-dressing behavior that created a bizarre dynamic where April, who had been born male, found herself married to a man who was drawn to feminine behavior and clothing. The relationship deteriorated quickly, with April claiming to have had a romance with the heir to the Spanish dukedom of Infantado, suggesting that her emotional needs were not being met by a husband whose attraction to her may have been based on his own gender confusion rather than genuine romantic compatibility. When April's lawyers demanded maintenance payments in 1966, Corbett responded by filing suit to have the marriage annulled rather than proceeding with conventional divorce, a legal strategy that was designed not just to avoid financial obligations, but to establish legal precedent that would define transgender status for decades to come. The case that became known as Corbett versus Corbett was not just about one failed marriage, but about whether transgender people could be legally recognized as their identified gender. The legal proceedings that lasted from 1967 to 1970 represented more than personal drama. They became a test case for whether British law would recognize gender transition as legally valid, or whether biological sex assigned at birth would be considered immutable regardless of medical intervention, psychological identity, or social functioning. April found herself fighting not just for maintenance payments but for legal recognition of her fundamental identity as a woman. Justice Ormrod's ruling in 1970 was comprehensive and devastating. He declared that the marriage was void because April was male, that it was impossible for anyone to legally change sex, and that gender must be determined by biological characteristics present at birth regardless of any subsequent medical or social changes. The decision was not just legal judgment but philosophical statement about the nature of gender, identity, and human possibility that would influence British law for more than 30 years. The impact of the Corbett decision extended far beyond April's personal circumstances to affect every transgender person in Britain, creating legal precedent that made marriage impossible, inheritance rights questionable, and gender-appropriate legal treatment unavailable through official channels. April had not just lost her case, she had inadvertently created the legal framework that would criminalize and marginalize transgender existence for an entire generation. But the ruling also revealed the extent to which legal systems could be used to enforce social conformity. By denying official recognition to people whose existence challenged conventional categories. April was not declared mentally ill or criminally deviant. She was declared legally non-existent as a woman, which was arguably more damaging because it eliminated any possibility of achieving social acceptance through legal means. The publicity surrounding the court case made April one of the most recognizable transgender people in the world, but it also made normal life impossible for someone who had originally hoped to transition quietly and live as an ordinary woman. The irony was complete. April had achieved global fame as a transgender advocate without choosing activism as a career, and she had become legally invisible while being more publicly visible than she had ever wanted to be. The restaurant that April opened with a friend after the court case, April and Desmond's in Knightsbridge, represented her attempt to transform notoriety into commercial success, creating a business that capitalized on her celebrity while providing her with income that wasn't dependent on conventional employment that had become unavailable to her. The restaurant attracted show business customers, including Ava Gardner, Ingrid Bergman, Keith Moon, and Dusty Springfield, suggesting that April's social connections and personal charm could overcome legal obstacles to create professional opportunities. But April was also notorious for her drinking, once boasting of consuming 32 martinis in a single night, suggesting that the stress of living under constant public scrutiny while fighting for basic legal recognition was taking a severe psychological toll that manifested in self-destructive behavior that threatened to undermine everything she had worked to achieve. The heart attack that April suffered in London in 1975 represented both a physical crisis and a symbolic moment when the accumulated stress of fighting legal battles, managing public scrutiny, and maintaining professional life under impossible circumstances finally overwhelmed her bodies to cope with ongoing trauma. Her retirement to Hay-on-Wye represented a strategic retreat from public life that allowed her to recover physically while avoiding the kind of media attention that had made normal existence impossible in London. The years in Wales were characterized by relative peace and privacy that April had not experienced since before her transition, but they were also years of exile from the life she had built in London, from the career she had lost, and from the social recognition that the court case had eliminated as a legal possibility. She was living as a woman in daily life but could not be legally recognized as a woman, creating a split between private identity and public status that was psychologically exhausting to maintain. The move to the United States represented another form of exile, this time from Britain entirely, as April sought countries where her legal status might be less problematic, and where she could rebuild some version of the life that British courts had made impossible to maintain in her home country. Her work for Greenpeace and later an art gallery represented her attempt to create meaningful professional identity that wasn't dependent on her appearance or celebrity, allowing her to contribute to causes she believed in while maintaining the privacy that had become essential for psychological survival. The second marriage to Geoffrey West on the cruise ship Queen Mary represented April's continuing search for romantic validation and legal recognition, even though American law might not provide any more protection than British law had offered. The fact that this marriage also ended in divorce suggested that April's legal status was not the only factor complicating her ability to form lasting, intimate relationships. But it also demonstrated her refusal to abandon hope for conventional romantic happiness despite decades of evidence that such happiness might not be achievable for someone in her legal position. The return to England in 2005 was motivated by the passage of the Gender Recognition Act 2004, legislation that finally provided legal mechanism for changing gender markers on official documents, offering April the possibility of achieving the legal recognition that had been denied to her for more than 40 years. The help she received from Arthur Corbett in obtaining her new birth certificate represented an extraordinary reconciliation with the man whose legal challenge had created decades of legal limbo for transgender people throughout Britain. The MBE that April received in 2012 for services to transgender equality represented official recognition from the same government that had denied her legal existence for most of her adult life. But it also represented acknowledgement that her involuntary role as test case in transgender legal rights had contributed to eventual progress in social acceptance and legal protection for people in similar circumstances. The exhibition, April Ashley, Portrait of a Lady at the Museum of Liverpool represented the transformation of April's life from personal struggle into historical artifact, allowing her story to be preserved and interpreted for future generations while providing educational context that had been absent from most media coverage of her life and legal battles during the height of public controversy. But the museum exhibition also represented the extent to which April had become more symbol than person, more historical figure than living individual, with her actual experiences filtered through interpretative frameworks designed to make her story inspirational, rather than accurately representative of the costs that pioneering social change often exacts from the people brave enough to challenge established systems. The interviews that April gave in her later years revealed someone who had achieved a form of peace with circumstances that had often been devastating. But they also revealed ongoing anger about the years that had been lost to legal battles, the career opportunities that had been destroyed by prejudice, and the relationships that had been complicated by social circumstances that should never have been allowed to influence private emotional connections between consenting adults. April's advice to younger generations: be kind to both yourself and to other people. Be beautiful both inside and out, because if you're beautiful inside, you're beautiful outside. But be bloody brave because you will need it. summarized both the wisdom she had gained through decades of struggle and the practical understanding that social progress requires individuals willing to sacrifice personal comfort for principles that benefit people they will never meet. But her advice also revealed the extent to which she understood that her own life had been shaped by historical circumstances that had required forms of courage that should not have been necessary, that had demanded sacrifices that should not have been required, and that had imposed costs that had been unfairly distributed among people whose only crime was being born into bodies that didn't match their psychological sense of themselves. April's death on December 27, 2021, at age 86 represented the end of an era in transgender history. The passing of someone who had lived through the transformation of transgender identity from psychiatric pathology to legal recognition to cultural celebration, experiencing every stage of that progression both personally and politically in ways that had shaped not just her own life, but the possibilities available to countless people who came after her. The obituaries and tributes that followed her death struggled to capture someone whose life had encompassed so many contradictions. She had been both visible and legally invisible, both celebrated and persecuted, both pioneer and victim of the changes she had helped to create. Peter Tatchell's tribute to her as the great trans trailblazer for decades acknowledged both her achievements and the costs that such pioneering had exacted. Boy George's description of her as a force of nature and transgender high priestess captured the extent to which April had become more than an individual person. She had become a symbol of possibility and resistance, proof that authentic identity could be achieved even under the most hostile circumstances, even when such achievement required sacrificing everything that most people considered essential for happiness and security. But the celebration of April's legacy also obscured the more troubling aspects of her story. The decades of legal limbo, the career destroyed by prejudice, the relationships complicated by social hostility, and the ongoing struggle to achieve basic recognition that most people took for granted. The transformation of April into inspirational figure risked minimizing the genuine costs that social pioneering had imposed on someone who had never chosen activism as a career but had found herself forced into that role by circumstances beyond her control. The legal changes that had occurred during April's lifetime, particularly the Gender Recognition Act of 2004, represented progress that had come too late to benefit her during the most difficult periods of her life. But they also represented validation of principles that she had maintained throughout decades when such positions had been legally and socially impossible to defend successfully. The continuing relevance of April's story in contemporary transgender rights debates demonstrated that the issues she had confronted were not historical curiosities, but ongoing challenges that continued to affect people whose gender identity didn't match their assigned sex at birth. Her life provided both inspiration for people facing similar struggles and warning about the costs that social change often exacts from individuals who find themselves on the front lines of cultural transformation. The museum exhibitions, academic studies, and biographical projects that had emerged around April's life represented attempts to preserve and interpret her experiences for educational purposes. But they also represented the ongoing need to understand how individual lives intersect with broader social and legal systems to create possibilities for change that often come at enormous personal cost to the people brave enough to challenge established norms. April Ashley's greatest achievement was not becoming a successful model or winning legal recognition. It was surviving 6 decades of social hostility while maintaining essential dignity, proving that authentic identity was possible even under circumstances designed to make such authenticity impossible to achieve or sustain. She had demonstrated that beauty could be a form of resistance, that glamour could be a political weapon, and that the most important battles are often fought by people who never wanted to be soldiers but found themselves on battlefields they couldn't avoid. The morning light that streams through London today illuminates a world where transgender identity is legally recognized, medically supported, and increasingly socially accepted. But April Ashley's story remains relevant because it reveals the costs that such progress often exacts from individuals who are forced to live through periods of social transition when old certainties are dissolving, but new protections have not yet been established. The last great transgender pioneer of the 20th century had proven that legal recognition could be won but only through decades of struggle, that social acceptance could be achieved but only by people willing to sacrifice privacy and normalcy, and that authentic living was possible but only for individuals brave enough to continue fighting when victory seemed impossible, and defeat was the only socially acceptable outcome. April Ashley died as she had lived, on her own terms, having achieved the legal recognition that had been denied to her for most of her adult life, leaving behind a legacy that proved individual courage could eventually overcome systemic oppression, but only after exacting costs that should never have been necessary and demanding sacrifices that revealed both the potential and the limitations of personal resistance to institutional injustice. In the end, April Ashley's most important contribution was not her modeling career or her legal battles, but her refusal to disappear when society demanded invisibility. Her insistence on living authentically when such living was literally illegal, and her demonstration that some forms of human dignity cannot be destroyed by legislation, social prejudice, or institutional hostility. She had lived as proof that authentic identity was not a privilege to be granted by authorities but a human right to be claimed by individuals brave enough to insist on their own existence, regardless of the costs that such insistence might ultimately require.